Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I am the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a formally trained macroeconomist, but currently I am a certified financial planner and wealth advisor. So today I interview Dr. Andrew Biggs, who is an expert on retirement savings and Social Security. So oftentimes I am asked my opinion on the state of the program of Social Security and what it means for my clients. And a lot of individuals, particularly younger individuals, will come into my office and they'll ask me in the conference room, they'll say, Drew, am I going to have Social Security one day? And some people make the assumption that they will have no benefit, that the program is going to be completely eradicated. So the question is, will Social Security be around after 10 years when it is projected to be insolvent? Then there's individuals that are starting to plan for maybe a lower benefit. So should they start to prepare for less Social Security? There's others that are planning for maybe they would get Social Security at a later age. But these are all really very uncertain but very important questions. The other thing that we talked about today is what will happen to current retirees. So will they see a reduction in benefit? What does it mean for them if the program goes insolvent? All of these things we address with Andrew Biggs. We even get into a historical analysis of how did we get here? And there was a critical turning point where the program became unsustainable in terms of the way they changed the equation around generating benefits for retirees. But at the beginning of the interview, we also talk about, in addition to the Social Security crisis, is there also just a savings crisis with the United States? Because you're hearing it from both sides of the aisle, from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump, that there is a huge savings problem, that people are not saving sufficiently to actually sustain themselves in retirement. Even folks like Larry Fink's, or BlackRock's Larry Fink, the CEO there, he's even suggesting that there's this major crisis, and he's in agreement with Bernie Sanders. But here's the question. Is that actually true? Are people less prepared, or interestingly, are they more prepared for retirement in terms of their savings rates? You're going to find that out today. So a little bit about Andrew. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. A little bit of history on him. So Andrew was the principal deputy commissioner of the Social Security Administration. And when he was there, he oversaw the policy research efforts. And then in 2005, he was the associate director of the White House National Economic Council, where he worked on Social Security firm with then President George W. Bush. So what I like and appreciate about Andrew is that he was very much on the inside with Social Security reform, and he's still very actively involved in the discussion in D.C. He has been an expert witness before Congress, and I will say, just getting to know him and talking to him and reading a lot of his research, he is one of the preeminent experts on the program itself, and so I think you'll find this to be a very enlightening interview, and I learned a ton in this hour and a half, so be patient. I know it's a longer interview, but so much important information comes out that I think will be enlightening for you as an investor. Andrew, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks a lot, Drew. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So there's been a lot of talk about an impending savings crisis. In fact, I came across a USA Today article, and they said this, quoting them: "A recent survey from a global investment firm uncovered a rare point on which Republicans and Democrats agree. America faces a retirement savings crisis." Now, you usually hear this kind of stuff from Bernie Sanders, right? Socialists like himself. But you're also hearing this from major party candidates like Donald Trump. But it's not just the public sector or politicians we're hearing this from, Andrew. We're also hearing it from the likes of the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink. And here's a Forbes article. This is the title I read this morning. Larry Fink and Bernie Sanders agree we have a retirement crisis. So, Andrew, are they right?
No, they're not right at all. I mean, I don't want to spoil the punchline, but no, they're not right at all. The interesting thing on the retirement crisis talk, it's right around the corner, it's imminent, is you can find studies from 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, that say precisely the same thing. So poverty is about to double among seniors. Half of people won't have enough money to maintain their pre-retirement lifestyle. And you look at those predictions made back then, and you see what's happened, and it's really been the opposite. A Census Bureau study found that the poverty rate among people over 65 dropped by a third from 1990 to 2016. And the Social Security Administration, where I worked, projects that it's going to continue to fall. Retirement savings are through the roof. More people are saving for retirement. You're delaying claiming Social Security benefits. So it's really precisely the opposite of what people predicted. And so, the interesting thing with each of these studies, you can go back and dissect it and pull on the strings or pull on the threads and figure out what went wrong. But the really interesting part of this narrative is that everybody agrees there is a retirement crisis except for retirees themselves. If you look in survey after survey, asks Americans, do you think there's a retirement crisis? And I disagree, but Americans feel strongly that there is. There's no question of how they're going to answer that question. But then if you ask retirees themselves how they're doing, it's an entirely different story. A few years ago, Vanguard did a nice survey where they asked retirees, do you think America faces a retirement crisis? And they, 60% or so said yes. And then they said, would you describe your own financial situation as a retirement crisis? And something like 4% said yes. And you can find the same in. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal maybe 6 or 8 months ago using Federal Reserve survey data, and they asked retirees, a series of questions, how to describe their financial security. And something like 4 or 5% said, I'm, quote, finding it difficult to get by. 86% said, I'm either doing okay or living comfortably. If you look in Gallup, they ask people, do you have enough money to live comfortably? Around 3/4 or 80% or so of seniors say they do. Among younger people, it's something like 60%. So if you ask retirees, they will not tell you there's a retirement crisis for them, but they just think there's one for everyone else. So it's a weird result, but partly is people are being told in the news media every day there's a retirement crisis coming, so they just repeat it, and yet it fails to arrive, I think, inconveniently for people who have that point of view.
So, like Bernie Sanders is saying things like an alarming percentage of Americans have zero retirement savings altogether. So where's he getting this data? Is he being dishonest with the public, or is he looking at it differently? Where's this narrative coming from folks like Bernie Sanders, do you think?
With Bernie Sanders, it's a two-stage process of ignorance followed by dishonesty. The ignorance is that he had his staff look at data produced by the Federal Reserve. It's called a Survey of Consumer Finances. And they ask people, how much do you have in retirement accounts, IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, and so forth. And he found that only about half of people approaching retirement had a positive retirement account balance, had money in a 401k or IRA. So then what he says is half of near retirees have no retirement savings. The problem is retirement savings isn't just money in 401ks. If you look in that same data source, about a third of people approaching retirement report they are entitled to a traditional defined benefit pension. Now, that's a little bit hard to believe. We've all heard they disappeared, but think how many Americans work for the federal government, state government, local government. Almost every one of them will have a defined benefit pension. teachers, and so they all have defined benefit pensions, and these are among the most generous in the country. They are the best prepared for retirement, but according to Bernie, they have no retirement savings. Similarly, if you think of people like small businessmen or farmers, they're often not in a position to start a formal retirement plan, but they'll either save on their own outside of a retirement account, or they'll derive income from their business in retirement. The Federal Reserve asked about that specifically. Do you have these various assets, a business, real estate, sort of taxable retirement or taxable savings accounts? Do you have those assets that will provide you with income in retirement? And when they added that, two people had a traditional pension and people who had a retirement account, you have something like 90% of Americans approaching retirement have retirement savings. And the remaining, to be honest, tend to be very low income. They get a high replacement rate from Social Security, which means they get a high Social Security benefit relative to their pre-retirement earnings. So in a textbook kind of financial planning model, if they're getting 80% of their pre-retirement earnings from Social Security, probably they shouldn't be saving. So this is, I spend my life looking at these factoids that seem just obviously to show that Americans are undersaving for retirement. But again, if you pull at the strings and say, what are they actually measuring? What are they saying? You find out that often it proves the opposite. That it really proves that most Americans who should be saving for retirement are saving for retirement. Young people in a textbook economic model shouldn't be saving for retirement because their earnings are very low. They've got college loans or whatever to pay off. Low income people probably shouldn't be saving for retirement. I'm talking very low, say the bottom 20%, because they're going to get this high replacement rate from Social Security. But then when you look at people who probably should be saving for retirement, think of married couples. They're a little bit older. They tend to have higher incomes. There's two of them, so they're planning their life together. Over 80% of them in IRS data are actively participating in a retirement plan. So the data are all there, to be found if you want to find them. The problem is if you get a factoid like Bernie's, half of Americans approaching retirement have no savings, it's too good to resist. And so, he'd come out with this claim. People would fact check it, including me. So they know it's wrong. But they just repeat it. It's too good to change. And unfortunately, that is the level of sort of policy discourse we have on this issue, and obviously on other issues in America.
Well, I can tell you anecdotally, as someone who works, with the public in terms of wealth management, that everything you said is extremely true. I mean, I run across people that, a Massachusetts teacher, for instance, oftentimes makes 70% of what their income was, and they still, even in some instances, they still will have significant assets they've been able to put away in things like 403Bs. Most of these school systems have very nice 403B programs, or thrift savings plans. And so the idea that they don't have any access to wealth is, just from an anecdotal standpoint, patently untrue. And listen, if you could get 70% of your income and then you have several $100,000 in a 403B, for most individuals, that's plenty of money for them to get by in retirement. Even in the state of New Hampshire, the pension is pretty healthy. And like I said, people continue to contribute. Then I've run into people, Andrew, that say they don't have a lot of money in 401ks. They have other assets, though, that they could liquidate. So on paper, maybe it looks like they're impoverished. They don't have a lot of money in their bank account. Maybe they don't have a brokerage account with investments inside of it. But then I'll find out that they have real estate, physical property that they could liquidate, or they have collectibles that they could sell. So I could see so quickly how the data could be deeply manipulated by an opportunistic politician on both sides of the aisle, frankly. So one of the things that I've heard, and one of the things I will say about financial rules of thumb, is that the rule of thumb is that they're all wrong. But you'll hear something like, a typical American needs about $1 million to comfortably retire. What would you say to a comment like that?
It's Well, I would agree. First, your rule of thumb is just wrong, in the sense of you're correct about rules of thumb. That there can be no single number. Sometimes you'll see these articles. What's your retirement number?
I know.
And the answer is it depends on what your pre-retirement earnings were. And the reason it depends so much is because Social Security is a progressive program. A low-income person, somebody kind of in the bottom 20% of the earnings distribution, will get a Social Security benefit equal to around 80% of their pre-retirement earnings. A high-income person, somebody in the top fifth, is looking at a replacement rate of 25%, maybe 30%. So if you want to, let's say you want to replace 75% of your pre-retirement earnings, that's a rule of thumb. But if you want to do that, the low income person basically doesn't need to save much at all. The high income person needs to save an enormous amount. There's a Federal Reserve study a few years ago that looked at sort of inequality in retirement savings. And what they found is when you factor in the Social Security benefits people are going to get, most of that inequality goes away, in the sense that the inequality is driven by Social Security. The low-income people don't need to save very much because of Social Security. High-income people need to save an enormous amount. So that's what you see. So you can't really come to a single number. But agreed. I did a piece in the Wall Street Journal a while ago where I looked at, instead of looking at what people claim you need in retirement, instead I looked at what people actually have in retirement, then whether they reported they were financially secure. This, I referenced the numbers before, where 86% or so of retirees said they were either doing okay or living comfortably. And if you look at the level of savings they have, it's nothing like $1 million or $1.5 million that people are claiming. It was $250,000. Even what you find is once you get above a de minimis level of retirement savings, most retirees say they're doing okay. The vast majority of people who say they're doing poorly in retirement are this tiny percentage who have essentially nothing other than Social Security, and it is a tiny percentage. It's probably less than 1 in 10 people. But once you get above that level, most people are doing okay. There's a variety of reasons for it, which I can get into it, of why we need less retirement savings than people claim, but all we have to do is look at the self-reported financial satisfaction of current retirees and then look at how much they have saved. And it just tells you don't need $1 million to be financially secure in old age.
Yeah, and look, I would, this whole idea you need a specific dollar amount is so insane because every situation is very unique. For instance, I could have a couple sitting with me and they maybe on paper don't have sufficient assets, but then you'll find out that there could be a significant inheritance that is 90% likely that they're going to receive, which completely alters the financial situation. I've also dealt with people that are extremely high income earners and they're making a lot of money, but when they retire, they don't need 75% of their income. They need like 30% of their income because they were really good with money and they saved a bulk of it and they built a lot of wealth and they're going to be absolutely fine. And so what I would tell people if you're listening to this is rules of thumb are really inapplicable as someone who manages money. And you're hearing this from Andrew as well, that statistically from all the research that he's quoting, there is not like that one number. Like you need $1 million or you need $500,000. It's all contextualized and it really depends on a variety of variables, such as do you have a pension from the local school district or the state, et cetera. When we talk about these issues, Andrew, one of my frustrations is there's just zero nuance that goes into it. And so the punditry, I think, in the financial media plays up a lot of issues that frankly aren't there. But when it bleeds, it leads. And so the boring narrative that you're frankly stating is not as enticing, but sometimes the truth is a teeny bit boring, if you know what I mean.
Sure. Nobody really has the incentive, I hate to say, to tell the truth about the U.S. retirement system. And I'm not saying the U.S. retirement system is perfect. But, if you think about the news media, if they have a news headline that says, Americans' retirement savings at record levels, which is true, people are like, okay, fine. But they're not going to click on that compared to say the Wall Street Journal had this story, which several years ago, which won awards as Americans entering retirement least prepared in decades. people click on that won
They
an
do.
award. Is entirely factually incorrect. They just didn't understand the data they were looking at. But similarly, you have people, I hate to say, with a political preference where they don't trust individuals to save on their own. They look at they look at the mistakes people can make. They are distrustful of the private sector. They think people are going to get ripped off by
So
the
true.
401k provider, and they'd be much happier, with government doing it. So they don't have any incentive. And then, to be honest, it's in the financial industry is, it. I don't think the 401k providers or BlackRock or whoever being dishonest. They believe in their product. But the pharmaceutical industry also believes in their product. And if you see an ad on the television that says, "Okay, you may have some ailment, and guess what?
Right.
We happen to have a treatment for this. Ask your doctor." Look, pharmaceutical industry does a lot of miracles for us. At the same time, though, you understand this is how they make their money by telling you
sold.
you may have a problem, and they're selling you something. And yet, when a financial firm comes out and says, "Oh, retirement crisis, you don't have enough money," people just take them at their word, not knowing, look, this is how they make money. If you don't save more, they don't make more money. So again, I don't think they're lying. It's just not, look, no, I will say there's certain people, your Bernie Sanders or some of these people who are purveying the retirement crisis, some of these researchers, they are in fact lying in the sense they know what they're saying is wrong. But a lot of the industry side is they just believe in their product. They think they're doing good for people. But the reality is any dollar you save for retirement is a dollar you can't use for something else. And if you're a low-income person that says, I've got to put food on the table, I'd like to buy a house, I want to send my kids to college, well, if you're encouraging them to oversave for retirement, then you're denying them those opportunities during their working life, and those years matter too.
Oh man!
So it's just having balance and some nuance to it.
You're striking a chord for me because when I sit down with so many individuals, I'll say this, Andrew, that it is more common for me to encourage clients to spend money. I'll admit I'm probably not the best, data set here because I tend to work with slightly higher net worth individuals. But I tend to, even for my more middle class clients, I tend to pressure them to go on vacations to enjoy life. A lot of these folks are, say, in their 60s and they're starting to push 70, or they're actually in their 70s. I'm like, look, you're going to leave, Billy and Susie a couple $1 million here. Why don't you enjoy it? Or why don't you enjoy doing nice things for your adult children and your grandchildren while you're alive? Why don't you take them on vacation? And so I agree with you that there's this sort of frantic crisis mindset. And I even see this with clients around my age. So I'm 40. I'm a millennial. A lot of my millennial friends, to their good credit, are really good at saving money. But then I'm watching them not engage in certain expenditures that I think would provide a lot of joy and satisfaction for their family, because they're constantly fed this narrative that they're not going to have enough money, that the world's kind of coming unglued. And what I hate about fear and selling on fear is that then people make pretty irrational decisions. I'll give a for instance. I remember counseling a friend that was looking at buying an RV. I was like, hey, man, you can afford the RV. Like you're not going to be starving to death when you're 60 or 65. If you think that in your trajectory of life, dropping $20,000 in an RV is going to completely derail you, when you know that the utility that you would experience, the satisfaction you experience with your family could be really great over the next 10 to 20 years, why would you not do that while your kids are still in your home? Because what I will tell you that I see all the time is that people will not spend any money while their kids are younger when they actually have the discretionary cash to do so. They won't spend the money when they're younger. And then I see the other end when they're actually in retirement and they don't know how to spend money. And so again, money's a resource. It's a tool to utilize it for things with your loved ones. And so, you're just striking a chord for me because I find this very frustrating. And again, I'm often encouraging clients to spend their money. I'm actually rarely in a situation, I have a few situations, but not many, where I'm actually really worried they're going to completely run out of money and they're going to have to get rid of their home. But that is the exception. The rule is I'm telling people to spend. So there is some problems, though. Social Security is not totally stable. What is the state of Social Security, and is it solvent? And if it becomes insolvent, when, Andrew?
Well, it's good that you mentioned Social Security. I actually have a book coming out in the spring, hopefully, and the title is "The Real Retirement Crisis." And part of the point is that everybody is saying, well, Americans aren't saving enough for retirement. If you look at the household savings part, yeah, and you can look up the data through the Fed or whoever. It's retirement savings are through the roof. The problems are all on the government side, and that's true in Social Security. It's if you look at countries around the world, the retirement savings gap is almost always much larger on the government side, and the problem for that is that in the public sector, you always have the incentive to promise benefits, but it's easier to get away without paying for them. If you have a 401k and if your employer says, okay, I'm going to make a matching contribution to your account, at the end of the year, they either made it or they didn't make it. Similarly with private sector pension, there's requirements of how much funding they have to do. When you look at something like Social Security or the pensions offered in state and local government where the accounting rules are really loose, that's where you find the underfunding. And so Social Security is just a case study, and I've been working on Social Security for 25 years. I was the number 2 at the Social Security Administration during President Bush's term. I ran their Office of Policy. I worked in the Bush White House on Social Security. So I know the program very well. And yet people often talk about fixing Social Security well as these technical issues. And look, you got to understand how the system works, which, to be frank, the average member of Congress doesn't. But that's not really the issue. The real issue is one of what you call political economy. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's that if you look back at Social Security, the last major reforms were 1983, and that they thought fixed Social Security for the long term. By 1984, their projections started to show a long-term deficit. By around 1990, they knew the Social Security Trust Fund would run out in the mid-2030s. For the retirement program, now they're projecting running out around 2033. So, really since 1990, 34 years, we've basically known exactly when Social Security's Trust Fund will run dry, and we also know the reasons for it. So it's the issue, though, is a member of Congress or a president says, look, I can try to fix this thing, take a beating by telling people you either got to pay more taxes or get lower benefits, or I can just pass the buck. I can just kick the can down the road, give it to the next member of Congress. But guess what? He's got the exact same incentives. And so the problem we face right now, today is that both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have the same position on Social Security benefits, which is unusual. They're united in saying we're not going to cut benefits for anybody at any time. Unfortunately, they're also united in not having proposed the tax increases necessary to let the system pay those benefits. Those things go together. You don't just need a promise; you need a plan, and nobody has a plan. So at this point, Social Security the trust fund would run out around 2033 for the retirement program. The disability program is projected to remain solvent because money was transferred to it about 8 years ago, and they think that's enough to keep it solvent for a while. Once the trust fund runs out for the retirement program, then the system is about 21% short of the revenues it needs to pay full benefits. And legally, it can't continue paying full benefits unless Congress somehow gets those revenues. So the default position, if we do nothing, is we cut benefits by 21%. Now, some people think that would mean across-the-board benefit cut. I just published a paper recently with a lawyer in D.C. arguing that the president really would have a lot more discretion. They could protect the lowest income people from falling into poverty, although that means more benefit cuts at the top. But the reality is, that's what's going to happen. And so you need to have some plan for fixing that. And it's easier if you do it today than if you wait until then. I'll just give an example of how acting quickly makes it easier. In the 1983 Social Security reforms, up until that point, the retirement age for collecting full benefits was 65.
Hmm.
In the 1983 reforms, they said we're going to raise that from 65 to 67, but they didn't start increasing the retirement age until the year 2000, and I think it reached 67 last year.
It just
So
happened.
so you have this span of 40 years, and guess what? Nobody complains about it now. It's not a big deal. Americans have increased their average claiming age significantly, so they've offset, for a long time, the typical person claimed at 62. Today, the average person claims at 65.1 or something like that. We are claiming benefits later, and when you do that, that offsets the effects of the higher retirement age. All of this was seamless because we had time to play with it, time for people to adjust. But if you say we're going to try to turn the Titanic on a dime in order to avoid the iceberg, that's a really hard thing to do. If you look at what happened in France, where they tried to raise the retirement age, I believe by 2 years over a 6-year period, people went nuts because it's a really hard thing to adjust to in such a short period of time. But this is simply poor stewardship. There is no technical reason we couldn't have fixed this years ago. People may not have liked George W. Bush's proposals. Had you done that, the system would still be solvent.
Correct.
And so it really is the thing that is just depressing is this is not some ancillary program. So it requires special expertise that you couldn't expect Congress to really understand. This is the largest federal government program. The people say, "Oh, this is a sacred trust. It's so important, greatest anti-poverty program everywhere," but they do nothing to try to fix it. Even Democrats will say, "Oh, well, you should do this and that." I'm like, "Well, when you had power, you didn't." They had control of the House, Senate, and the presidency in the early years of the Bush administration. They didn't do anything. And so it's now they say, "Oh, Republicans want to do something." Well, who knows? It's really just an abdication of leadership. And that's what we need. We just need leadership and some courage, but we don't have very much of it right now.
Well, and there's no incentive, and you've said incentive a couple times. There's no incentive for a current congressional person to actually do anything about it because they want to get reelected, and so they might as well just kick the can down the road because they may not even be in Congress in 10 years, right? When it actually
and this
becomes
comes down
insolvent.
To we do need leadership. But I don't want to abdicate the American people on this. The reason you need leadership is because a lot of people left to their own devices don't want to do anything. I ran some numbers and I said, okay, imagine if in 1984, when we first knew Social Security faced a long-term deficit, just imagine we raised the payroll tax kind of as needed to keep the system solvent. So we'd raise a little bit in 1984, a little bit in 1985, and so on. Now, the benefit of that would be that people retiring in 2033 would know that Social Security is fully solvent. They would know their benefits are going to be cut. The downside is if you're an average wage worker, you would have paid about $125,000 more in taxes over your lifetime. If you were a maximum wage worker, somebody, for this year, the maximum taxable salary is $168,000. If you were making that level, you would have paid, 300 and something thousand more in taxes over your lifetime. Now you say, well, okay, the upside is they know their Social Security benefits aren't going to be cut. The reality is their Social Security benefits aren't going to be cut anyway. That by and large, cuts in 2033 in reality, in political reality, are going to tend to be small. And so what happened is Americans played a game of chicken. They said, we're not going to agree to pay these higher taxes to keep Social Security solvent, but we're just going to dare you to cut our benefits. And when the trust fund runs out, we dare you. Go, see if you can do it. The reality is they're not going to, you're not going to get a 21% cut. And so this game of chicken made sense. And so everything we have of how Americans' attitudes towards Social Security reform and then how those played out in Congress were exactly what the incentives would tell you they would be. Nobody acted irrationally. They acted precisely rationally. They acted in their
Good point.
self-interest, which is why we are where we are. Now, if this was a private sector program, say a private pension, you'd understand how these weird incentives play out, which is why we have regulation. We understand a business might not want to fully fund its pension, so we say you are in fact required to do that. Government doesn't understand. They have exactly the same incentives, and so they don't self-regulate by requiring that they fix these things. And so, this is not a problem of government versus private sector, or profit versus nonprofit. This is an issue of human nature. People like to, procrastinate. They like to do things that are in their interests. Apply those incentives to Social Security, and you get exactly what we've got.
So 2033 rolls around. You don't necessarily think there's that 21% cut. So then how do they fund it is I guess a question. Is this, do we monetize this? You
can't really monetize it. And the reason for that is Social Security benefits are adjusted for inflation. And you can't really monetize Medicare either because what you're promising is a service, not a fixed dollar amount. You're saying, okay, we're going to give you your pacemaker. If the pacemaker doubles in price as inflation, Medicare's got to pay double the price. So it's really not, the entitlement problem isn't something you can easily inflate your way out of. Now, maybe they'll borrow and try to monetize that debt, but financial markets aren't stupid. They'll figure this stuff out very quickly. And so that's something like that leads me to worry that you reach 2033 and say, what do we do?
Right.
It's one thing if you put in place a plan of we're going to raise taxes and cut benefits, but we're going to phase it in so we'll have a few years of debt. That's okay. I'm not saying it's good, but it's not going to trigger a financial crisis. But what I'm thinking is a more likely outcome now is the government just says we're going to borrow the money. I mean, Donald Trump, as far as I can tell, his policy for Social Security is to transfer general tax revenues into Social Security, and those general tax revenues will be borrowed. It's one thing.
So deficit spending, is that how you would look at it?
I suspect, yeah.
Okay.
But you can say, well, we have, we've had deficits for a long time. Why would it matter? The reason I think it matters first because the deficits in debt are much larger. I mean, we're looking at a deficit of $1.8 trillion this year. That's a ton of money.
Totally wild.
The debt is really high. But there's also the way it's structured in the sense of if you look at projections from the Congressional Budget Office, they say, okay, we've got unsustainable deficits in debt. But the reason we don't have a financial crisis today, the reason people will still buy treasuries at reasonable yields, is they assume that at some point the government is going to step in and address the deficit in debt. I mean, if you thought the government was going to borrow forever, you would be a fool to buy treasuries. You would have a financial crisis right now. The reason we don't is that people assume the government is going to step in. But if you hit 2033 and the federal government says, look, our policy for Social Security, the biggest program in the federal government, is we're just going to borrow money with no blueprint whatsoever for paying it back, that's when I head for the exit. I mean, why would you? Because you're
it's a disaster.
It's not just like a actuarial projection of insolvency and debt. It is a policy of it. And if that's your policy, then you've got a real problem. So there's a question of when the financial markets just say we've had enough.
It seems to me that the bigger crisis has less to do with do retirees receive a lower benefit. The bigger crisis is this just becomes a fiscal nightmare for the United States, which then puts, the dollar is the world's reserve currency still. I think it's in the close to 70% or in the 60s at least. So, but people are going to lose faith in the United States dollar and they're going to lose faith in treasuries. Things politically always play out a little bit differently than the vacuum scenario. So I think we're all thinking about the retiree and what they're not going to get. And I don't think there's any political appetite to your point. I think it's really important that they're just going to accept a 21% decrease. So we're going to fund it through additional deficit spending. And if that's the case, then the downstream impact is, are we finally at that point at which the United States debt is truly unsustainably high and people lose faith in it? And to your point, do people head for the exits? Andrew, any idea of how much in dollar terms we would be short in 2020 or 2033 and 2034, roughly at that 21% mark? What is that as a dollar amount?
If you were, say for 2033, I think it's about 335 billion in today's dollars. So in nominal terms, it would be something higher than that. That's a lot of money. And you quickly get up to the 400 billion range. You don't see very many people proposing, hey, let's have a $400 billion tax increase this year, a $400 billion spending cut. But that's the sort of stuff that you're looking at if you don't want to just drive up the debt. Now, the interesting thing, and I think this is the fortunate thing, is if you look at 2033, you say, okay, that's the last year in which Social Security's trust fund will be solvent. Technically 2032, and it runs out in 2033. So that's the last year we got a solvent trust fund. But it's also a first year. It's the first year in which a high-income couple, both making that $168,000 a year, could receive a benefit that is over $100,000 combined.
Wow.
in today's dollars. Now, if you talk about Social Security in any sort of political context, you'll hear phrases like safety net, anti-poverty, blah, blah, blah. Fine. But that's not what is making Social Security expensive. Protecting people against poverty, just as a little mathematical example, let's say we gave every retiree a Social Security benefit set at the poverty threshold. If you do that, you take poverty in old age to zero. Everybody's getting something to take them out of poverty, and you would cut Social Security spending in half. The point is, most of this cost burden is we're paying higher and higher benefits to people who are already the richest retirees in the world. If you go to OECD data, that's the kind of Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, sort of the data source on high-income nations, and you can find what they call the disposable income for different age groups. At the median, the typical U.S. senior has the second highest disposable income in the world after Luxembourg, which is basically a tax haven. But our seniors are much richer than UK or Sweden. We're richer than Switzerland. And this is sort of a weird point, but if you think at any given time, we take it for granted that poor people need more assistance from the government than rich people. This is true with state welfare programs. It's true how Social Security works, true with Medicare and all that. But at the same time, if you think horizontally, over time, we are getting richer and richer and richer. And so you would think that as we grow richer, we don't need so much from Social Security because we have so much more in private retirement savings. I mean, it's anybody who says retirement savings have not increased since 401ks kind of took over from traditional pensions has not looked at the data. I mean, there is this inflection point in the 1980s when savings really start going up. Savings are at record levels in every age, income, educational, and racial group. So whatever you think about, you'll hear some factoid. Oh, the average American approaching retirement only has X in retirement savings. Guess what? X is a lot higher today than it was 20 years ago.
That's right.
So we are getting richer and richer and richer. You can start scaling down benefits for middle and high income Americans so that Social Security doesn't go broke. I mean, that $335 billion we'd need to come up with in 2033 to keep paying full benefits, that's the largest peacetime tax increase in U.S. history. Now, I'm a sort of fiscal conservative. I don't like tax increases. But imagine you're a progressive and you don't tax increases don't bother you. My point to a progressive is imagine you get handed to you on a platter the biggest peacetime tax increase in U.S. history. Is this what you want to spend it on? You could spend it on Medicare for all or better infrastructure or child care, all these things in the wish list, global warming. But instead, you're going to pay it so that we can pay higher and higher benefits to middle and upper income retirees who are already the richest seniors on earth. It just doesn't seem to make sense whether you are liberal or conservative. So it's just not a pressing need. Preventing poverty, that's a pressing need. Paying $100,000 a year in Social Security benefits, not a pressing need.
Not a pressing need. And we don't need to go to the fiscal brink of not just insolvency of Social Security, but insolvency of the United States government over wealth transfers to middle and upper income individuals. I mean, I just think this is such a critical point. Now, something else that I think is the assumption from most people is, hey, Andrew, I paid in the system all these years. It's my money. I put in a proportionate amount with interest. I want my money back. Is that true? Like, are people actually like? Because people will say, well, Social Security is not really a social welfare program. It's not even a social safety net. It's a pension that I paid into, then I deserve it back. What do you say to that?
Well, look, if we all fully paid for our benefits, why is the system going broke? I mean, it's got a $25 trillion unfunded obligation. That didn't come out of nowhere. The reality is,
could you make the argument, just to play devil's advocate for a second, could you make the argument that it was mismanaged, that they didn't invest it properly? As a quick aside, and then I want you to finish your thought.
No. I mean, to the degree Social Security has, assets, their treasury bonds. I don't, and you can talk to financial people and I can give you a pro and con on, if you're going to fund Social Security, what kind of assets should you hold? But I think the reality is that's not, it is not a mismanagement problem on the investing side. If you're interested, we can talk about that. But it's not even a government stole the money problem. I mean, when people say, if they would just repay the trust fund, Social Security would be solvent. Like, we are repaying the trust fund. We've been repaying the trust fund for the past 15 years. And by 2033, that's when the trust fund is fully repaid. All your supposedly stolen money is back in there, and we still have this massive problem. The real issue is that throughout Social Security's history, we've been paying people more in benefits than they paid in taxes, including interest on those taxes. Now, this was just crazy at the beginning. If you want to know why Social Security is so popular, it's because, it's like, a great weekend in Vegas or something. You put a little money in, you get a ton of money out. Okay, people like free money. We've proven that. The thing is, Social Security is not as good a deal today as it was in the past, but even if you look in calculations done by the Social Security Administration's actuaries or by the Congressional Budget Office, people retiring in the mid-2030s, right when Social Security is going broke, according to the CBO, will receive, on average, benefits that are 26% greater than their lifetime taxes plus interest on those taxes. Now, so you get a point where, at that point, Social Security is 21% short of
Why are we doing this?
Funds. So you're kind of like, if you're just thinking simple fairness here, you should get back what you paid in. Just cut benefits and be done with it. Now, that's not what I would do because there's a whole variety of reasons for that.
Right.
Partly is because the people who had the best deal are the lowest income people, and I don't have any problems with that. That's why we have social insurance. But this idea that I fully paid for these benefits, that's not what the numbers show. And so if we had something that was more reasonable, and like I worked for George W. Bush, and he wanted the idea of personal accounts for Social Security. I understand the various controversies, and honest people can oppose them. But there was something you get out of it, what you put into it.
I love that idea personally.
But again, with something like Social Security, we don't have, it's not regulated. There's no checks and balances. There's nothing from preventing the government from promising you more than you paid in. And I pointed this out, a year or so ago in a Wall Street Journal piece, and I was up for confirmation. President Biden, this is 6 months or so ago, nominated me to be on the Social Security Advisory Board, and which advises the Congress and Social Security about these things. And in the confirmation hearing in the Senate, they dug up this op-ed that I wrote in the Wall Street Journal. All they had read was the title, which is you didn't earn your benefits or something, and they're all up in arms, and nobody had actually read the op-ed, which simply cited the CBO and Social Security saying, in fact, people have not paid for their benefits. If you want to give it to them, fine, but we shouldn't pretend we fully paid for these because the math says you didn't. And so partly and then this is the same as our discussions about the retirement crisis and so forth. That these are not philosophical questions. They're where nobody can know. There are numbers. Look up the numbers. And so in all these cases, I deal with people who say things I hate to say which just aren't true. But you say, look, here's where you can find it. Let's have an evidence informed policy making. Instead, we have sort of policy-based evidence making in the sense of people know what policy they want and they just sort of concoct or point at evidence in quotes that they think supports it. The whole process is backward.
We are subsidizing all retirees, including high-income earners, and especially high-income earners, and that seems to be really the crux of the problem. So let's step back for a second. We were talking this, pre-interview. How did we get into this mess? So just take a few minutes with Social Security. What was your general sense, say, of what was the original design of Social Security in the 30s? And then there's a critical tipping point in the 70s, which I really want to talk about. Talk about the 30s when FDR and Congress, pushed this through. What was the intent of the program? Was it meant for poor people largely? Was it meant for all Americans? But go ahead, Andrew.
It's the history of this stuff is really interesting, and often we act as if FDR came down from Mount Sinai with the gold tablets that had the Social Security Act written on it. And that's not it's if these are human beings and politicians the same as us, and so you kind of think of how the dynamics played out at the time. Now, up until the Depression, up until FDR's administration, the federal government really was limited in the things it did. I mean, you had in Germany and the UK, you had these government-run pension systems. We didn't have that. We had sort of state-based, need-based assistance to the elderly. So, means-tested benefits for seniors who are poor. When FDR wanted to rationalize this, and that's not a crazy thing to do. We want to have a system rather than this sort of ad hoc stuff. When he came into power, he appointed a commission there called the Committee for Economic Security, and they were designed to put flesh on the bones of this idea of sort of a national pension program. And there's 2 points of that I think are worth pointing out. Today, one of the big debates over Social Security is the Social Security payroll tax only applies the first $168,000 in your earnings. You only earn benefits based on those earnings. And a lot of people on the political left say, it's just insane that we don't tax all earnings. And again, that'd be fair. Yeah, there'd be a very large tax increase, there's sort of tax implications of that. But the reality is, if you look around the world, our tax cap is actually much higher. I mean, in Canada or the UK, it's probably $70,000 or something, much lower than ours. But the interesting thing with FDR, with this Committee on Economic Security, they set sort of a wage cap. But what they said is, the original committee said anybody with earnings above this level won't even participate in Social Security. They're just, we assume they can save on their own. We're going to let them save on their own.
But they're participating in the program, right, Andrew? So they are participating, but they're not going to get a benefit in the future.
They are,
Is that how it was working?
Under the original framework from this committee, they just wouldn't pay in, they wouldn't collect. They were just outside
they wouldn't even
of
pay
it.
in.
They wouldn't even pay in.
Okay,
they wouldn't even pay in.
Okay.
And so this idea that, it's common sense we should have rich people doing this highly redistributed thing to the poor, that's not how it seemed to them. Now, there's practical reasons why they didn't do that. It's not like people are just rich every year of their life. Their income and earnings go up and down. So they decide, okay, we're going to put all of them in there, but we're going to have this cap. And above the cap, you're just not going to pay taxes. You're not going to earn any benefits. And there you go. So that was part of the philosophy. That tells you why we have this capped system. But there's a second element as well of why we have what you call like an earnings-based system, an earned benefit. And what that means in the Social Security benefit formula is Social Security is relatively more generous for poor people. If you are very low income, you will get a Social Security benefit equal to 90% of your pre-retirement earnings. If you're high income, you might get 35%, something like that. But in dollar terms, benefits rise. Higher income people get higher dollar benefits than low income people. But there's an upshot to it. If you're very low income, you didn't have much pre-retirement earnings, your Social Security benefits could be extremely low. And so the way this plays out over time is, despite all the rhetoric as Social Security is our most important safety net program, the way the system is designed is that the very lowest income people are going to get little or nothing from the program because they're too poor. They had so low contributions. And at the same time, you're paying high income couples close on $100,000 a year. That's when people like the idea of an earned benefit, an earnings-based system, but that's in fact what it gets you. And it's not, as social insurance, it's very, very inefficient because you're not giving people money to people who need it. You are giving them money to people who don't need it. And people might like, oh, well, I want to get my money back. But what it means is the whole system has to be much, much more expensive than it otherwise would be. Your taxes are going to be much, much higher than they would have been. One thing that got talked about at the time the Social Security started was doing what the UK did and still does, which is essentially a flat dollar or flat pound benefit. Everybody who reaches retirement gets the same benefit. That's much more effective at preventing poverty because you have a minimum benefit, and it's also much cheaper because you're not paying people $100,000 a year. The objection, and this is where you get into politics and the history of it, which are interesting. People say, well, FDR, they assume he was just the king or something, but he wasn't. He had to go through Congress. The heads of the committees in the House and the Senate who had to process Social Security, I guess it would have been Ways and Means and Finance or whatever they called it at the time, they were both Southerners whose fathers had fought in the Civil War and not for the winning side, if you get my drift. So their objection, and this was in public. There's an interesting work by Christopher Pope from the Manhattan Institute where he pulls up newspaper clippings from the time, and they say, well, if everybody gets the same benefit, if it's too generous at the bottom end, the Negroes are going to sit on their porches and support their families, where it's not going to be enough for hardworking white people. I mean, this is a point in time when people were very open about this stuff. So that's why you have the system we have today. Where they said, okay, we're going to base it on earnings, so that the low-income black guy, the sharecropper in the South, he's not going to get very much in benefits, but a high-income person is going to get much more. So this structure is not based on economic logic. It was sort of based on, partly is this idea we don't want to give money to the poor, but there was clearly this racial element in it. Now, we're more enlightened today, so maybe we don't need to do that anymore. So that's interesting in the formation of it.
Yeah.
But if we can fast forward from 1935 to 1977, the interesting thing is from 1935 to 1977, Congress raised Social Security benefits something like 9 times, if I remember right. And yet Social Security didn't go broke. And the reason for that was the original Social Security benefit formula didn't have automatic increases in benefits. It just, benefits were increased by Congress, on an ad hoc basis, sort of as needed and as affordable. And so they say, okay, look, the benefits are starting to get eaten away by inflation, let's raise them. Or we can afford to pay more because the economy is growing in the 1950s, we'll raise them. And people think that's a bad thing because, look, they tend to raise benefits in election years, and you get how that works, and so maybe that's not great. But it put a natural limit on things. They knew if they raised benefits too much, they're going to have to raise taxes, so you had this balancing factor because people don't want to pay higher taxes. Now, what happened in the 1970s through there's various technical things going on, but they had to make a fix to the systems, to the benefit formula. And at that point, they decided, instead of using these discretionary benefit increases, we're going to have the system automatically increase benefits for future retirees. And what I'm talking about here is not just the COLA that you get after retirement, but the initial benefit you get in the first year you retire. Now, I'll just tell you, under the current formula, that initial benefit rises. The average person retiring next year is going to higher benefits than the average person retiring this year, even after counting inflation. So you get this increase. In 1977, they said, okay, we want to kind of make it automatic. And so they put aside, or they put together this expert commission, which actually included a guy named Peter Diamond, who was MIT and future Nobel Prize winner. And they looked at different ways of doing this, different ways of working the formula. And the commission unanimously said, okay, we want to go with this approach, which is kind of more modest. And what they said is this approach that they proposed, benefits would rise kind of slowly over time And they said this will be affordable. If we want to raise them more, Congress can do it in the future. Instead, and this is coming from the Carter administration, they said, no, we want to lock in place this more generous formula where benefits are automatically going to increase at a higher rate. Next year's retirees are going to get benefits that are higher than this year's, and so on and so on and so on. Now, that formula, just as an example, a person retiring this year, the average person retiring this year gets a monthly benefit that's about 40% higher than somebody retiring in 2000, even after factoring out inflation. So if you're somebody that says benefits haven't risen, A, you're wrong, but B, that's a function of that automatic formula. This, in my opinion, is when the Social Security crisis happened. When they put ink to paper, because from 1935 up to 77, Congress could do it at their own discretion, but they also had to weigh how much taxes you needed. And so they're balancing these things. What happened after 1977 is you started promising people future benefits, and then what that meant is that you were going to have to raise taxes in the future. The problem is, it's one thing for Congress to say, okay, we can't raise benefits quite as much as we thought we were going to. You get a smaller rate of increase. Is completely different politically than saying, we've promised you this larger increase and now we have to cut it back. Because people have been told they earned these benefits. So in 77, Congress put in place a formula that they knew at the time was going to lead to insolvency because it was promising people more in benefits they were going to pay in taxes. Most people don't know this kind of stuff, so all they know is they've been told they earn these benefits and they think they're being cheated. So it's sort of, what is your baseline? And if your baseline is current level benefits, but we can boost it, that's fine. If your baseline is high level benefits, but we have to claw it back, you get the kind of rhetoric you see in politics over Social Security. It was just a foolish mistake made by people who were told by an expert panel, don't do it, and yet they did it. So this, again, it's another example of our problem is not really demographics or economics or anything. Our problem is just poor stewardship of the program. And politicians like to promise things, they don't like to pay for them. So that's why we have a system that's promised $25 trillion more in benefits than it has in revenues to pay for them.
And I think the amazing thing, too, is because what you usually hear is like, well, we've got a demographic issue and we just don't have enough people paying into the system as we have retirees. But that becomes a completely moot point if you don't change the fundamental equation that occurred in 1977. It doesn't become a demographic issue, correct?
Yes, it's what the 1977 amendments or reforms to Social Security did is they locked in place increases in benefits based on increases in national average wages, or basically increases in benefits based on the growth of the economy. So what this meant, though, was economically, you can't grow your way out of the Social Security problem. Some people will say, well, my Social Security has some special policies make the economy grow faster. It doesn't matter because they locked that in place. And then they say, having done that, then they say, okay, now our problem is entirely demographic. It's just population aging, more longer lifespans. But essentially, it becomes the issue because you've said nothing else can be the issue. They constructed the formula. They made it the issue. Yeah. And they say, well, there's nothing we can do about this. We just got to suck it up. I'm like, but if somebody today is receiving 40% higher real benefits than 20 years previously, that didn't just happen by itself. That was a policy choice. If we had made it instead of 20% higher, made it 15% higher, something like that, and just kind of gradually, slow the growth, Social Security could be still solvent. Retirees would still have the highest incomes on record because retirees' incomes are growing mostly because we're delaying retirement and we're saving more. So we're getting more from private retirement plans. All of this could have been ours without this Social Security crisis, but it was politicians basically thinking of themselves, not thinking of the future. And that's, again, it's human nature, but it's just, if my politics lean right, and so I'd have friends and colleagues who are more progressive, who have much more faith in government. But part of when I think about this, I just look at something like Social Security, where they knew what they were doing. They were warned, don't do this change because it's going to bake insolvency into the cake, and they did it anyway. And that's just that's a problem with politics, with the incentives that are there, which is why I've argued for something similar to the UK system, the Australian system, where government provides a base benefit that will guarantee you are not going to be in poverty. But then on top of that, we have essentially universal 401ks, and you save for that sort of income replacement function. That's something government can do. But government promising benefits and then not paying them is something universal, and that's a huge problem when you've got a program as large as Social Security.
So where do we go from here? Is there hope? As you're talking the whole time, I'm thinking, could we not just simply at some point revert back to not giving these people excessive benefits beyond what they're putting into the system? Like, could we go back to a system like that? Is there enough time to do something like that? So how do we go forward, Andrew?
I'll be honest, I'll just say it's a much more difficult thing today than it was when I kind of got into this game, 20 years ago. At that point, you had plenty of time. You really had a lot of interest. President Bill Clinton was very interested in Social Security. George W. Bush was. Mm-hmm. You had tons of interest in Congress. The problem was the incentives were always to delay.
Bad.
And if you're somebody who says, I'd prefer just to fix this by raising taxes than to cut benefits, the incentives were always to delay. Because every day, 10,000 baby boomers shift from being workers paying into the system who care about their taxes to retirees collecting benefits who care about their benefits. And at the time, this was obvious, and I kind of figured this would sort of favor Democrats who tended to be more on the tax increase side, the Republicans who were more on the benefit cut side. What I didn't really foresee was that it would help push a change within the Republican Party itself. It's George W. Bush, who I worked for, would have solved as much of the Social Security funding problem on the benefit side as he could have. He knew he might have to raise taxes. He was open to compromise. He wasn't rigid, but his preference was to reduce benefits for middle and higher income people gradually over time.
So what you've been proposing essentially, so
yes,
he was listening to you on that.
Yes, but Donald Trump's position is we're not going to cut benefits for anybody at any time, no matter how much they're getting. Partly is you just have a shift within the Republican Party itself. When I was a kid, I thought of seniors as sort of a Democratic constituency. They grew up under FDR. They like all the programs. They're now more Republican constituency. So for Republicans, the politics is really weird because they're currently saying we're not going to cut your entitlement benefits, and that's what drives the budget deficit. But they're also nominally a low-tax party. They don't want to raise taxes either. So they've got a mathematical contradiction in a way the Democrats don't. The Democrats on Congress know that the tax increases they proposed for Social Security aren't going to happen because they know they're very unpopular. But at least they'd be willing to enact them if they could. On the Republican side, you just have a mathematical contradiction. And I don't know how that's going to get settled. I suspect what you're going to see is, especially if Republicans control Congress, is a bit more of a push in the next Congress for a fiscal commission, one of these bipartisan commissions to look at Social Security and Medicare. The thing is, everybody needs some cover. Republicans have promised never to raise taxes. They know they're going to have to break that promise. Democrats have claimed they're never going to cut benefits. They also know they're not going to get that. But they need cover to break their promises. So they can say, look, I still believe this, but for the good of the country, we're going to come together as some sort of compromise. That could work. The problem is what it needs is presidential leadership. And, do
you trust either of the candidates? We're recording this before the election. It'll probably come out several weeks after the election. Do you have any confidence in either major
It is.
candidate?
I mean, I have in a sense. I think they're both capable of providing that leadership if they wanted to provide the leadership. So it's not trust in the sense that I think they're just idiots or something. It's more.
But do they have the political will? I guess is probably the better question.
If you look at Social Security in this election versus past elections, I mean, in the past, say George W. Bush was running and he'd be working with people from think tanks, he'd have some, semi-detailed plan. Al Gore, whoever would have his own plan. None of that happens anymore. Neither candidate really has much of a plan for Social Security because I don't think either candidate is particularly interested in Social Security. So the real issue is interest. Do you care about this versus other things? And look, if Congress pushed the idea of a fiscal commission and say Republicans in Congress pushed Donald Trump very hard and said, look, we got to get this thing done or we are basically screwed in the future, he might then say, okay, I'm going to play this role and push everybody together. And, Kamala Harris in theory could do it as well. The main role for the president is not in proposing a plan. It is in pressuring and pushing both sides in Congress to come up with something of their own. If the president has their own plan, it becomes then this big political fight. I think the president should cast himself more as a neutral party of putting the squeeze on Congress to do the right thing on these issues.
So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but let's just let's play this out a little bit because there's a great deal of uncertainty. But I guess I'm trying to be a little bit more practical because this has real ramifications for my clients and for investors more broadly. That you kind of have to somewhat game plan for potential. I'll give a for instance. When I'm doing financial planning with clients, we will use financial planning software and we'll use Monte Carlo simulations and we'll map out different possibilities. And we'll run 1,000 different simulations based on historical market performance. And I can, it can kind of show people an upper bound and a lower bound of what their wealth could look like, say 20, 30 years into the future, okay? Whether they're pre-retiree or current retirees. I can say, all right, hey, with $2 million, you could have $30 million if you hit this 1% possibility market scenario that did occur historically, or you could be at $200,000 if you hit the worst case scenario, the worst sort of 3-decade period, okay? But the reality is that they're able to engage in the process of understanding probabilities and what that means for their portfolio. We're operating with fixed numbers on Social Security, though, and that becomes challenging for people when they step into my office. And the reason I wanted you on today is that I'm constantly asked, Andrew, well, what the heck's going to happen to my benefit? Some clients will say, I'm not going to have a benefit. Some clients assume their benefit's going to completely unchanged. Some people under 50 think it's going to change. Some people above 50 think it's going to change. There's been all these different proposals. So there's a lot that I'm asking here, but let me start with a simple question. What do you think is likely to occur if you had to guess? And I know you don't know the future, but do you think they raise the cap on the $168,600 above that point in terms of taxing your income? Do they raise your age the way they did from the 1983 law change where they raised it from, say, 60 to 65 to 67? Do they lower benefits? What do you think is practically going to – or do we just wait until we get to this point in 1933 where we just all take a 21% haircut or we blow out the debt even further? Of all those different scenarios, if you had to guess, what do you think is the most likely one?
I wish I could tell you it's just one of those things, but basically you would need to do all of those things. And this is the context of. You'll often hear people say, "Oh, Social Security, it's a manageable problem, not such a big deal." Let me just give you an example. Imagine we increase the Social Security retirement age from 67 to 69, so a 2-year increase. And a lot of people say, "Oh, it's unacceptable. We can't do that." Well, that would fix less than 1/5 of the long-term funding gap.
Really? That's it?
Yes, that's it.
Less than 1/5.
So you have this policy people think is outrageously austere that barely scratches it. This is a big problem. So I think it is likely. Everybody hates raising retirement age. I think it's likely that will happen.
Okay.
Probably you're going to increase the cap, and the difficulty is that, say, at one point, about 90% of total earnings were subject to Social Security taxes. Today it's dropped to about 83%. So if you put it back up to 90% again, which some people on the Democratic side will talk about, okay, that takes the cap to about $350,000, something like that.
It's a big tax increase for a lot of people, by the way.
It's effectively speaking, it's a 12% increase in your marginal tax rate for people who are in that range, because you're going to pay the extra 6%. People say, oh, my boss, my job is going to pay the other 6%. But all the economists working this agree essentially the payroll tax, the employer share is borne by the employee. So
I would pay my
they're going to
employees
have to,
more,
they're not
by
going to
the
give
way,
you the
Andrew.
raise.
Yeah, just to interject, like I have employees. I would pay my employees more if I didn't have to pay them that. And this is basic economics, that those types of things are borne by the employee, regardless of who functionally pays. That is a huge misnomer. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, and this isn't some out there theory. If you propose Social Security legislation that increases the employer's payroll tax, the Congressional Budget Office and the Social Security Administration's actuaries will assume it immediately comes dollar for dollar out of employee wages. So that's, well, what that means is effectively you're looking at a 12 percentage point increase in your top marginal tax rate. For a lot of people who are, they're not, these people, they're flying first class. They're not flying on private jets. These are not Bernie Sanders, millionaires and billionaires. So that's very unpopular. It's possible they could go for a surtax at the very top to try to reduce the taxes in the middle. It's tough because there's a ton of people making from 168 to 350. There's not that many people making more than 350. So, it's why you rob the banks, because that's where the money is. But I think you're probably likely to see that, probably some progressive benefit cuts at the top end. At this point, I would suspect it's more tax heavy than benefit cut heavy, just because the politics have shifted in both the Democrat and Republican parties. The politics of Social Security shifted to the left. So it used to be, I think it was 50-50 tax increase, benefit cut maybe 75-25 now. So if I were approaching retirement, I mean, look, I'm going to turn 65 in 2035 or something like that, 2033, right when the trust fund runs out.
Sorry.
I don't lose very much sleep over it, partly because I save a lot for retirement, but also, I've devoted my career to cutting benefits, and, for better or worse, I've not been very successful at it. So I don't, unless I happen to succeed in cutting my own benefits, right at the last minute, probably I'll be okay. But if I were stress testing it, say for somebody retiring right when the trust fund runs out, you might stress test it at 10% cut your Social Security benefits and say, okay, how would you do with that? I suspect it's unlikely anybody's going to get hit with a 20% cut up front. But if you stress test it 10%, I think that's reasonable. I think for people who are younger, one way of thinking about it, Social Security is what we call actuarial deficits, about 3% of wages, meaning you'd have to raise the Social Security payroll tax rate by about 3 percentage points to keep it solvent. What you could do is just increase the amount you put in your 401k by 3% of your wages. If we pass a reform plan, we raise the Social Security tax rate, then you can reduce the amount you're saving. If not, then the chance of benefit cuts is bigger. You might want to keep saving at that higher rate. This all assumes that people are not thinking about Social Security insolvency now and how much they save. The average person is saving more than you'd think for retirement today. So it really depends on the person, but I think you want to just stress test different benefit levels and think about it in those terms. But I think it's more likely we do it on the tax side, more issues with borrowing by the government, and that's a longer term impact, but it's also a bigger problem because then you might trigger inflation. That these things get pretty difficult.
Okay, so that's where there's all these downstream impacts. Like I was thinking as you were talking, okay, so we raise taxes. Well, there have been some few historical periods where we've raised taxes, and it doesn't necessarily lead to increased government revenue. And I guess I don't know how you feel about the Laffer curve, but there's one of those, the possibility. I think the Laffer curve is imperfect, but that is something that always concerns me is, okay, we're going to raise taxes on people, but if there's a 12% increase, if people making up to $300,000 are paying as you put 12% more marginal income taxes, there is a crowd out effect at a certain point where it could lead to less economic output. And so maybe we on paper solve the Social Security problem, but I'm still going back to the national debt as my long-term fear. I think this really gets beyond just this is so much more systemic in nature. Like when the housing crisis happened, it wasn't just about housing. It was like the whole financial system came to its knees. We became less concerned about houses. We became more concerned about the fact that credit markets were freezing up completely in 2009. I look at this like it'll be almost – it's not that it'll be less about Social Security benefits, but it could freeze up the nation in an economic and in a fiscal sense, and that's what really troubles me. Are you concerned, Andrew, about could this reduce revenues? And maybe not reduce, but not give approximate amount of revenues as the amount of increase in taxation, proportionally speaking?
I'm sure of that part. I mean, there was a study, this is getting a little bit older now, but it was done by two, left-leaning economists, including one from Berkeley who was, very left-leaning. And, they try to look at the dynamic effects of raising the Social Security payroll tax ceiling. And, under what they characterize as sort of middle-of-the-road assumptions, you didn't lose revenue on net, but the net revenue is significantly lower, probably 25% lower than what you'd think you'd get. And there's a couple of reasons for it. It's not that people say, it's because high income people stop working, and it's not that. But let's say we just talked about how if we eliminate the Social Security payroll tax ceiling, that raises the top rate by 12 percentage points, and we assume that your employer is going to reduce your wages to cover their half, so 6%. What happens in that case, though, is that lost 6% of wages you're no longer getting paid is no longer subject to federal income taxes, is no longer subject to Medicare taxes. So you get an offset there. And this doesn't demand any sort of behavioral response by the worker. It just demands what we assume the employer is going to do. So you're losing money in that sense. It's not really for Social Security, but Medicare and the rest of the budget. But then if you assume behavioral responses, you lose some more. And so, it's very inexact to say what it's going to be, but the reality is that you're not going to get as much on net as you think. And I guess it's a sort of a separate point, but we've talked mostly about Social Security, but we also have a big Medicare funding problem. And the issue is if you say we're going to raise taxes for Social Security and for Medicare, really your tax burden just becomes just implausibly large. So you have to say which, if we're going to raise taxes, which is it going to be for? Social Security is the program that is easiest for people to substitute their own savings for the benefits that the government provides. I mean, not for low-income people, but for middle and high-income people, Social Security is not a safety net. It's not an anti-poverty program. It is simply a substitute for your own savings. Cut my Social Security benefits, I'll save more in my 401k. Medicare is a much more complex thing because Medicare is, in fact, an insurance program, and people in old age have wildly different healthcare needs. And so it's very inefficient to try to save your way out of a healthcare problem. It's the same with long-term care issues, that it can be very expensive, but the average person pays next to nothing on long-term care, which, another reason I'm not that worried about retirement security. Those are things that are better handled by insurance programs where the costs are very uncertain. And plus, healthcare is incredibly complex. So if you're going to raise taxes, do it on the healthcare side for Medicare, but that means you got to cut benefits more on Social Security. Look, just reduce benefits for middle and high income people. Set up a national 401k. So everybody, if you don't have a plan from your employer, we set up something like the thrift savings plan that federal workers get. I mean, the UK did that, pardon me, about 10 years ago. They set up a system where if you're not offered a retirement plan at work, you're automatically enrolled in this supplementary account, which is similar to a 401k. Their private sector retirement plan participation rate went from about 40% to, I think it's 86% today. I mean, it's done. It is massively cheaper than increasing Social Security benefits. It's just not that hard to do. But the thing is, Democrats are less trustful of private markets, but the real problem here is Republicans who don't like the idea of, they say, well, this would be a mandate on the employer, although it's essentially not. They don't like the idea of automatically enrolling people. But, what I've told them is like, those accounts, the supplemental accounts, would still be voluntary. Higher Social Security payroll taxes aren't voluntary. So why don't we go with the thing that's voluntary? But they're just so scared of anything on this that it's just, I'm just not going to do anything. Well, okay. I mean, a couple of years ago, I had a breakfast with members of the Ways and Means Committee. These are the Republican members, which is the main sort of tax writing committee in the House of Representatives. And what I said to them is, 10 years from now, either you or your successors are going to vote for a massive tax increase. And some of them are like, oh, I won't. I'm like, yes, you will. Because this system's going to run out of money. And if you don't do something to make up for the difference, then you're going to feel no choice. You are going to pass this thing, not just the Democrats, you Republicans. And I'm sure this is going to happen. But if they start today and say, let's enroll everybody in a retirement plan, the savings start building up. The more people save on their own, the less the burden that Social Security has to bear. And this is just common sense. It's not some radical, libertarian fantasy. It's just if people save on their own, then government can play the safety net role. Government can do that. Government is terrible at pre-funding and paying for future benefits as promised. It's just terrible at it. But people are good at it. We're putting more and more money away for retirement today. We save much more for retirement today than we did back in like the 70s when defined benefit pensions were kind of at their peak. We save much more today. More people saving more for retirement. This is a household private sector thing. Government's bigger and bigger unfunded liabilities. That's what they do. So figure out, what each sector can do well. And this isn't that hard. But it just demands political will, and that's not something we have much of.
Yeah, so you pretty much kind of laid out what you would do, but summarize it like you're the king of the universe, you're the president. Let's say you're the president of the United States, and you've got Congress on your side. What would Andrew Biggs do in an ideal situation if you could do it today, 2024? What proposals, what reforms would you do immediately to make the system solvent for the longer run?
The temptation with a question like this is, here's what I would do to, COLAs. Here's what I do to the retirement age or whatever. I don't think that's the best way of thinking about it. The best way of thinking about it to me is if we've got somebody who's entering the workforce today, they haven't paid a penny into Social Security, they're not owed a penny by Social Security, what kind of retirement system makes sense for them in the 21st century? The answer is probably not, what Social Security looked like in 1935. We would recognize that financial markets are much better developed, people are more financially literate, the internet makes it much cheaper to manage these plans. So we say, let's sign everybody up for a retirement account. But we also recognize some people are become disabled. They're very low income. Something happens to them. They can't provide themselves. Let's have a safety net. Okay. That is very easy to do. It's cheap to do. You don't have to talk a lot of actuarial mumbo jumbo for people to understand that logic. Where the actuarial mumbo jumbo comes in is how do you transition from what we have today to what we've designed for this 18-year-old?
So you would phase the old system out is what it sounds like you're saying. So slowly phase the old system out and phase in, because basically it's like, if you think about it, Andrew, it's like companies that have phased out defined benefit plans and phased in defined contribution plans. Is that what you're suggesting at a national level?
What you would do, the idea, it would still be Social Security, it would still have a lot of the same benefit formula. What I would do is I would increase the minimum benefit for Social Security, so nobody's going to get a benefit below the poverty threshold. I would do that very quickly so that you were have a noticeable effect on old age poverty. Then over a longer time period, a couple of decades, I would reduce the maximum Social Security benefit so that eventually everybody's getting the same thing. Now people say, oh, that's crazy. But guess what? If you're in the UK, if you're in Australia, if you're in New Zealand, countries which are very similar to us, that's what they do. Canada has something which looks like Social Security, but the benefits are much lower than Social Security. They're also not redistributed. It's just a flat kind of replacement. But the reason I looked at these Anglo countries is, nobody cares what's going on in Belgium or France. They just think about these things differently than us. But the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, they're very similar to us in most respects. What they don't do is pay $100,000 a year to a high income couple.
Yeah,
if you
that's
had that high income couple retiring today, they'd get $96,000 a year. If that same couple were in Canada, a civilized country by all regards, they get something like $31,000 a year from the Canada pension plan. Now, if you propose that kind of benefit for the U.S., people say, people are going to be starving. Well, Canadians aren't starving because high-income people, they just save more. This is not... It's an odd sort of thing that, my progressive friends assume that high-income people, use every trick in the book to avoid taxes or exploit their workers or whatever.
They don't.
But, they don't. Most of them just pay. But you say, if we cut their Social Security benefits, we assume they're not going to save more. Of course they're going to save more. I mean, this is, and there's plenty of evidence that they would. So I'm not just speculating. This stuff is doable. Make a system that is like Australia or the UK or New Zealand, where the government has a really strong role in the safety net. I want people to feel sure they're not going to retire into poverty. There's no reason a rich country, people should be worrying about this, and they do worry about it. At the same time, government has a place, but government needs to know its place. Government's place is not promising people $100,000 a year, because we are never going to save enough to pay those benefits. We're not willing to tax enough, and so we get ourselves in this bind. So each sector, public sector and private sector, does its thing. Now, the short-term question is tough. I mean, the plan that I've proposed, which is phased in over several decades, when I first came up with this, after I left the Bush White House in 2005, it was easy. Just phase it in over several decades. Social Security never has any problems. It is a problem now because we waited so long. This is what the Social Security crisis looks like.
Yeah.
I wish I had magic. And this is the thing. If you get something in public policy, they're always like, well, if you just do what I say, everything's fixed. My thing is, if you just did what I said, everything would be fixed. But now, we made our bed and we're going to lie in it. And so it's going to be tough. And this is our own fault. It's Americans' fault because we don't care. It's our politicians' fault because they ran out for office saying they were going to be leaders and they weren't. But this is not going to be an easy transition. So probably taxes have to go up in the meantime. There may be some debt. The sorts of ideas I propose, sort of a guaranteed poverty level benefit for everyone. If that's all Social Security is doing, that's easily affordable. The system would run surpluses in the future. So in theory, you could borrow short term, pay it off later. My own view would be, if you need the money, just raise taxes in the short term. I'm not a pro-tax guy, but at some point we got to pay our bills. And there's no reason our grandkids should pay for stuff that we should be paying for ourselves. So suck it up and pay.
Agreed. I think that's practical. One final comment before we wrap up. And I want your feedback on this. Here's what I'm not hearing you say, that Social Security is going to be completely eradicated in 10 years or the program is completely going away, which is a common thought, and I hear that often in my conference room. So what do you say to that?
Well, has anybody proposed to get rid of the Social Security payroll tax? Not that I'm aware of. Look, as long as we have 100 million people paying 12.4% of their wages into the system, you're going to have a lot of money to throw around. That's the virtue of a pay-as-you-go system. The downside of a pay-as-you-go system like Social Security is it's hugely sensitive to demographics. But, the Social Security Trust Fund running out is not like your 401k running out. If your 401k runs out, you got a real problem.
It's
but
over.
The trust fund was never providing that much of Social Security's income. Most of it is just coming from taxing workers. As long as we tax workers, we have money we have a lot of money to play with. It's, as I said before, we could give everybody a poverty level benefit at half the current tax rate. This is not a difficult problem to solve if we're focusing what we want the system to do. But it just becomes more difficult when we take our eyes off the ball and all these ancillary things like the $100,000 benefits come into it.
Andrew, this has been an incredibly enlightening discussion. Thanks so much for coming on and taking all this time to talk to me and my listeners today.
It's been a pleasure. I apologize I can't be more optimistic on things, but it's a fascinating issue to work on, both the Social Security side and the retirement savings side. So as a researcher, I really enjoy doing it, but I think it's very important to Americans as well to think about those. So I really, really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to your audience.
Yeah, and I think you care about the truth, and that's what matters. And if you're optimistic because it's the truth, great. But if you're optimistic and it's a lie, that's a problem. So I just appreciate the political reality of the situation so that we actually understand what's going on, and then maybe if enough people can hear from folks like yourself, we can actually make thoughtful changes to the system and generate the political will to make the appropriate adjustments. But again, thanks so much for all your insights today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com, or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.